Okay, so mobile navigation. This is from our lecture at Harvard that we did yesterday, so you can ignore that slide. So what is navigation? What is this idea of navigation? It's a pretty broad term, right? It doesn't really have any specific definition, but you can more or less think of it as like how you go from one screen to another screen in your app, or how you navigate, how you move between screens. So web navigation is pretty oriented around URLs. You change the URL bar. That is then seen as go get this page, or this is now the current location, and then the page updates in response to that to reflect whatever screen is appropriate for that URL. Mobile apps don't really use URLs. It's not really a concept that exists for the most part, with the exception of when you're linking into an app from the outside. But in terms of moving around within the app itself, URLs aren't used really almost at all, except maybe in some weird cases. So another problem with navigation APIs on iOS, or in React Native rather, is that they are completely different on iOS and Android. And so not only are the navigation patterns different, but really like they could not be more different. Everything about the navigation APIs are completely distinct on iOS and Android. And so what needs to be done there is just like the rest of React Native, where we don't ask you to know the distinction between how to render an image on Android and how to render an image on iOS. You just use an image tag, and then we deal with the underlying details for you. We need to have some kind of equivalent to that for navigation in React Native. And so there are several libraries that attempt to kind of provide this abstraction for you. And we're going to talk about React Navigation. So to give you another quick look at what I mean by navigation, right? We scroll through a website, click on something, URL changes, website changes. We're all familiar with this flow. Nothing particularly fancy. We have a back button, we have a forward button, we have a refresh button. There's a URL bar. On mobile, you have a way to swipe back, and you can swipe forward. I believe on desktop, depending on the computer that you have as well, you can swipe back on your trackpad. And so you get a lot of this sort of UI and logic built into your application for you in kind of the shell of the application. And that is not at all the case on mobile. On mobile, or rather in mobile apps, you essentially have full control over the UI and the behavior of how you move between screens in the app. And this is really great, but on the other hand, it does require you to learn a bit more when you're getting started. You can't quite just think immediately, I'm going to go to this URL and this page will change. So the patterns I'm showing here are one very common pattern, having a tab bar. We switch between tabs, the screen switches. Let's just play that again. When you tap on one of the items in one of the screens, it will sometimes push a screen over top of everything. Sometimes the screen will slide in underneath the tab bar, and then as you switch to another tab and go back, that needs to be there in that spot, as well as remembering the state of all the other tabs that you're in. So it's a little bit more of a complicated problem than web navigation. And yeah, we need to have a good solution for that. So that's why we're working on React Navigation. And hey, it's freezing again on the same spot. That's great. Almost. There we go. So I think it's worth talking about briefly the alternatives as well first. As I mentioned, there are a few libraries that attempt to solve this. And they mostly fit into these two categories. First is they're implemented mainly in JavaScript with React. That is what React Navigation does. And the second is they're implemented mostly in native, and we simply expose an interface to JavaScript that wraps those APIs in a way that tries to kind of flatten over the differences as much as possible. There are various trade-offs associated with that. I linked to this document in our docs called pitch and anti-pitch. So we try to be very upfront about what we think the trade-offs are, and we hope that other libraries do that more often as well. So check that out if you are seriously looking into building a React Native app and want to get some informed ideas about what library you should choose. So the first step, we install React Navigation, obviously. Currently, there's a beta version of 2.0. I didn't really want to teach people old stuff, so I'm just probably next week or the week after, we'll release the final version of 2.0, so I just stuck with that one for now. So there are some key concepts to learn about in React Navigation. There's navigators, routes, and screen components. So a navigator is a component that implements a specific navigation pattern. So in the example we saw, tabs, that would be a tab navigator. Within that, you have some way to navigate between screens inside of a kind of history stack. That would be a stack navigator, and so on. So each navigator must have one or more routes. So you say this tab has a home tab, it has a settings tab, has all these other kind of things. And the route is considered to be a child of the navigator. Each route must have the same, or must have a name and a screen component. And the name is typically unique across the app. So that's kind of like saying this specific key refers to this screen, regardless of where that is nested within this hierarchy. There can be exceptions to that later, but by the time that becomes a thing, you will probably have the intuition necessary to understand why there is why you might want that to be an exception. The screen component is just a React component, and the screen component can also be another React component that is a navigator. That is kind of a weird sounding thing, so let's just look at what that sort of means by adding a navigator to just an empty app. So the most simple navigator is a switch navigator, and what it does essentially is it displays one screen at a time. Inactive screens are unmounted, and the only action a user could take is say, go from this screen to this screen, and now go to this screen, and so on. It's kind of like the switch router in React Router. So pretty much just looks like that. You're on screen 1. You press go to 2. Screen 1 is unmounted. Screen 2 is mounted, and so on. The way that that looks is we say import create switch navigator, and then create switch navigator is a higher order function, returns, or rather higher order component that returns a component which is the one that we will render inside of our app. And the parameters to this function are it's a map with a route name, it's a string, and the screen component. So we're essentially mapping some string to a component and saying it belongs to this navigator. I think we all hopefully know. If you don't know what higher order components are yet, definitely read the guide in the React docs. TLDR, it's a function that returns a component and usually takes a component as well. So when we want to go to another route, we can do something like render a button, and when you press on the button, we call navigate on this navigation prop and pass in the name of the route. Navigation prop is passed into every screen component, and it has this set of props on it. It has navigate, go back, set params, get param, dispatch, etc. This is fully listed inside of this screen in the documentation, along with a bunch of other information on how to use them. But we're just going to talk for now about navigate, and we're going to put together a little example that just shows us how to switch between some things. And if I can find the appropriate thing here, that's a good one. All right, let's add React Navigation next, and open up the tab. Oh, I've already got examples there. Let's get rid of it. All right, I guess I don't need that so much. So I'm running this command exp start, which you saw in the previous section of my speaking, is a command to basically start the packager. Packager, think of it, it's called Metro Bundler in React Native. That's the equivalent of Webpack. So we still need to build our JavaScript and serve it from somewhere so that we can load it into some app that then executes it. Let's just open this up here. So loading this switch example, and I'm going to export the example from the root. And as we saw before, let's make that a lot bigger. And bigger. Create switch navigator from React Navigation. And let's just add a couple other things. View, yeah, button, view. So that's good. From React Native. Let's add some stuff. So if you're not familiar with React Native, Vue is essentially a div. That's pretty much what we're doing here. Most of the styles in React Native are inline styles. There's another way to do it by using something called stylesheet.create. Still an inline style, but you would define the styles in JavaScript. I'm just inlining it directly here into the style prop for convenience. But the other is more efficient. Let's add a border to it. Border color. And let's get rid of that. Let's add a button component, which we saw before was props navigation.navigate route name 2. Then let's use everybody's favorite tool to make it legible and go on. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this one and say screen component 2. This one will just say go to 1, route name 1. And change this one just to orange. So that does some stuff, but it doesn't actually, all we've done is define these two components. We haven't attached them to the navigator or actually rendered anything. So let's create a navigator. Oops. Switch navigator. And this one was called route name 1, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Screen component 1. And oh, that was not right. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to say export default class app. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this returns a component which encapsulates the logic of a switch navigator. It takes these routes that map to screens, and then it injects the navigation prop into the screen so that we can navigate between them. Of course, we can't actually refer to these screens here because they haven't been defined yet, so I'm just going to move that to the bottom. And maybe it'll run. Okay, it ran on the first try. Not bad. And now we can switch between screens. Of course, this really isn't that much different from like set state, where you say this thing is visible, this thing's not visible. But of course, that doesn't really scale too well when you have 3 things or 4 things. Yeah, so this kind of helps in that case. But this is sort of a kind of boring example. So I'm going to jump ahead now that we have that foundation to, I'm going to skip this one, and that one doesn't matter, to Stack Navigator. So this one is where it kind of gets interesting. Stack Navigator is the thing that we saw in the video example where the screen slides in on top of the other screen, and you can swipe back and has a header and all those sorts of things. So it provides this platform-specific layout. It looks different on Android. It looks different on iOS. And the actions users can take is push. They can push items to the stack. They can pop items. They can replace the current item with another item. Where I'm saying item, I mean route. And they can pop to top and various. Actually, I think that's it. But potentially other things maybe as well. And it kind of looks like this, right? You push a new thing in, it comes on top. You pop it, it slides away. And let's just go back to there. And when we look at the stack, what's actually being rendered when we have 3 screens there is we actually have the previous 2 screens still mounted and in memory. And that's because we actually need to retain the state that they have. If on screen 1 you scroll down halfway through the screen and When you swipe back, you go back to the first screen, you kind of expect it to be in the same spot that you left it. Any transient state in the screen should be how you left it. And similarly, when you start swiping back, you don't want to have to re-render the entire screen before the active one in order to see the content on that screen kind of revealing itself and sort of providing that cue to the user that you're going back to this screen. The syntax for doing this is pretty much the same, or the API rather. We switch the word switch with stack, and we call navigate. If we have time, we'll talk about why, when you might use the word push instead of navigate here. Here's a new one. When you want to go back to the previous screen, you can call it go back on navigation. And yeah, let's go ahead and do this then. I'm just going to copy this over to, looks like I don't have one there yet. One-stack.js. So let's switch it from switch to stack. Oh my god. Stack. Now if we go back here, good call. Yeah, app. I need to actually import that one. And you can see that now we have a header. God, maybe you can't see that now. There we go. Okay, now we have a header up top, and when I press go to 2, it pushes it on top, gives me a back button, goes back here, and so on. We can swipe back this, etc. Right. Of course, we probably need to do a little bit more with the UI surrounding the screen that we're working with. We might want to set the title, change the colors, add buttons, that sort of thing. And for that, there's this concept of navigation options. And the way that we work with this is by adding a static called navigation options to the screen. And then we could specify here header title is screen 1. And if we pop back here, see that now it says screen 1 up there. We could say header tint color is red, and now it's red. Header style, background color, black. Maybe we'll just make this white. Right. Hides the status bar. That's another thing you can look into the React Native docs about how to deal with that. But essentially, those are the ways you can customize that. Additionally, like I was mentioning, we can, let's just get rid of that. Add buttons. So if we say header right is button let's just come on, prettier. Doesn't seem to want to fix that. Maybe now. Oh, syntax here. Press me. Got it. Jump to the wrong file. Got it. Title, press me. Oh, yeah, good call. Yeah. Okay, so we have this button now in the top right, and we can render any component that we want up there. I'm just using the button component because it's built into React Native, and it's super easy to use as a demo. One other useful thing to know here is that navigation options doesn't have to be just an object. It can be a function that returns an object. So this function is provided with the same navigation object that is passed into the screen component. So it would be the same thing as this.props.navigation.navigate or go back. We can also use that in the header by using this navigation object. So I could now put navigation, navigate, what was it, route name 2. And that'll go to the other screen now. Another thing that's pretty useful, often this is where people start to think, okay, but if I was running a component, I could pass in props to my component. But at this point, like, you're not actually rendering the screens. You're navigating to a screen, and so you don't have control over what props are passed in. You just know that the navigation prop is passed in automatically from React Navigation. And so what we use instead of that is this concept of params. And so it's very similar to how in a web browser you will navigate to a URL and provide something like a query param. The difference is we don't have to serialize that to a string, of course, because we're in the same runtime. So we can just pass it in directly as an object. Or if you really need to, you could pass it a function or some non-serializable object. But Eric might get mad at you. And the reason why he might get mad is it actually makes it difficult to do certain things like we can actually serialize the entire state of the application and then reload the whole state once you go back. And so when you reload your entire app, even when you're not using hot reloading, we can get you to the exact same screen that you were in before. And it just improves the development flow considerably, I think. But yeah, let's add something here. I'm going to pass in a param to the second route. I'll just add in some value, which is a let's get random number like this. I'm going to create a function. And let's make that readable. So the way that looks is navigation.navigate, route name, second parameter, value, get random number. All right, that is, at this point, quite useless because we don't actually consume that anywhere, and I can't see my cursor. There we go. But if I go to the second screen, I can add some text here. Of course, I have to remember to import text. And say this is props.navigation, get param, value. And then I can provide a default value as well and say no value or whatever we want to put there. And do that. So if I press this, it'll say no value because using I didn't update the button in here, I only updated the button in the header. But now if I use the button in the header, then it passes the parameter as expected, and we're able to present that. We can also use the parameters in the header, which is a very common thing to do. If you're, for example, you have a profile screen and you want to show the name of the person or user or whatever in the title, then you can just say header title navigation.getParam value. Nope. Oh, I made a mistake. Navigation get param value. Nope. Oh, I think I have to call. So it has to be a string, and that was a really bad error to indicate that. But so now we have in the title just some dynamic value that was passed in through a param. And so that's how you kind of communicate between them. The only other thing that's worth mentioning is that if for whatever reason you want to update the param from inside of the component, you can call the setParams function. And that's often a way that people communicate with the header, essentially. So you might have a button that says like save, and maybe save is disabled, and then the form becomes valid, and then you set a param form enabled true, and now the save button becomes enabled in the header. Yeah, that's a basic idea of, I think, maybe how React Navigation sort of works. Eric's going to talk about some like crazier ideas with React Navigation and related to web. So yeah.